From our 22 News Broadcast Center, this is 22 News in Focus.
Good Sunday afternoon and welcome to 22 News in Focus. I'm Laura Hutchinson. We're 2 weeks into the new year and already it's been an active year in the nation's capital. Lawmakers worked to pass a deal on the highly anticipated fiscal cliff just hours after the clock struck midnight on New Year's Day. And now focus has shifted to the debt ceiling and, of course, other important legislation that will impact all of us here in Western Massachusetts. So today we're going to talk to Congressman Richard Neal about what it all means and how it will impact us. Then later we'll talk about our local economy and jobs numbers here and hear how you can get a fresh start looking for a new job in the new year. But first, we're going to begin today with the big decisions that still need to be made on the federal level and what's ahead in 2013. So joining us today to talk all about it, we have Congressman Richard Neal joining us. Thank you so much.
Delighted to be with you, Laura.
Boy, all eyes were on Washington leading up to the new year and the fiscal cliff deal. Those negotiations must have been exhausting, first of all. What do you feel about the deal that was reached?
I think that the deal was about as good as conceivably could have been reached. And I think that in every instance, one can argue for the perfect, but in legislative life, you frequently end up arguing about the possible. So my sense is that many of the incendiary words that were used for months were cast aside, and we got down to hard negotiating, and we ended up with a deal that maybe you couldn't love it, but finding something to like is what a legislative prescription generally is.
Something needed to be done because there was a lot of talk as to what would happen if nothing was done. So, of course, this was something rather than nothing.
Well, the other point that I think is noteworthy, recall that we kept talking about the cliff when the truth is that we actually went to the precipice, but because that vote actually occurred, we didn't go over the cliff. Now, I know in technical jargon, one might argue, well, you did go over the cliff because the deal was reached on New Year's Day.
Sure, right.
But the precipice is a more accurate use of language.
What were you proud of that was in there, and what are some of the ups and downs in this? So we saw some tax breaks continue, and we saw some discontinued.
Let me retrace because I think modern history bears this out. When Bill Clinton said goodbye, there was a surplus of $5.3 trillion. Now, that's from the Congressional Budget Office. They are professionals who did this scoring. They're not Democrats and they're not Republicans. The decision was made in 2001 to cut taxes by $1.3 trillion, and then in 2003, $1 trillion more. I voted against both of those tax cuts. And in between, intermittently, the decision was rendered to go to war with Iraq. So you have this huge turnaround in terms of fiscal reality based upon substantial tax cuts and the obligation of equipping our men and women for warfare. Now, I voted against the war in Iraq, but it also bears noting that once that decision is made for them to go, they need proper armaments.
Got to pay for it.
You've got to pay for it. And so for 12 years, the country had tax cuts year after year after year. I was consistent to this extent. I opposed the tax cuts with President Bush in 2001 and 2003, and then I opposed the same proposal from President Obama when he asked for the extension 2 years ago. And my argument is this: the war in Iraq is going to end up costing America north of $3 trillion. And how do we come to that determination? Well, it's estimated that the immediate cost is $1 trillion, but if you're a young man or woman who has served us honorably in the military, and you've been wounded in Iraq or Afghanistan, of which there are now 47,000 who have been wounded, more than half have claimed disability upon returning. That means that if you're 20 years old, you're going to be in the care of that VA system, arguably for perhaps the next 50 years.
Wow. And we've got to pay for it.
And you've got to pay for it. So I guess that arithmetic in the end is what brought Congress to reality.
So some of these tax breaks continued and some did not. The Social Security tax cut was one that ended up disappearing. So more people are paying more in Social Security.
The payroll tax is also something that's a long-term investment. Remember, the payroll tax is what undergirds Social Security. So the decision to cut the payroll tax from 6.2% to 4.2%, that was never to be a permanent fixture. Instead, it was treated then, in terms of description, as being a tax holiday. So the administration, coupled with the Republican majority in the House, they both were prepared to let that expire. Recall, you pay into it with the notion that eventually you're going to collect the benefit. That's what a payroll tax is, and everybody is involved with payroll taxes.
You know, you made the argument that you didn't support this in the beginning. So some people may think that some of these tax breaks should have never happened in the first place. But at what point do you determine that the economy is stable enough to undo all of this? Or is this just the new norm and we need to make it permanent and that's just the way life is now?
Well, I think that you can see that there are times when tax cuts make sense. I think that when, for example, you use what is known as accelerated depreciation allowance. If the economy is sort of stymied and there's not been any growth and you want to encourage some investment in new equipment, then I think it's appropriate to use accelerated depreciation allowance. You simply say, well, you're going to get a break on your taxes if you purchase some new equipment. So I think that those kinds of tax cuts are important. I think the theology that was used during many, many years, almost 3 decades, that tax cuts pay for themselves, you can't find a mainstream economist that would embrace that argument. Now, let me say this. I think that some tax cuts at different intervals are better than others. But I think that the jury really is out on this whole notion of when it's best to apply tax cuts as a remedy. Sometimes, if you're not careful, it's too late. You only further deficit problems. And other times, as I would argue, I think that had we decided in 2001, looking at this huge surplus, if we had decided to cut taxes for middle-income people marginally, I think that that perhaps would have jump-started the economy. And at the same time, remember, Alan Greenspan said we were paying down the debt too quickly. The clock in Times Square, which chronicles the size of the debt, it had been turned off during the Clinton years.
Oh, my gosh.
And I think that these facts, which are not opinion, they're facts, need to be returned to as we proceed with this debate over some of the looming fiscal issues that are sure to confront us, not in the next couple of years, but in the next couple of months.
Of course, and the debt ceiling, or the, of course, the debt ceiling being one of them that's going to need to be addressed. The alternative minimum tax, I also want to talk about that, because that was something that was included in this deal.
I've been at that for years. I've been trying to kill that tax, and we succeeded. The alternative minimum tax was put in place in 1969. There were 2 votes against it in the House of Representatives. I went back and did the research on it. And it actually should not be called alternative minimum tax. It simply should be called minimum tax. The idea was that the IRS published, not names, but they published the suggestion that a number of very wealthy people in America had not paid any income taxes. So the idea became, how do we prescribe for those folks a minimum tax so that they can't take advantage of exemptions and deductions in the code to prevent proper payment? The problem is it was never indexed for inflation. The result was that what was initially meant to be aimed at very wealthy people then became targeted towards those who might find themselves making $60,000 a year as joint filers with 2 children.
Wow.
That was never the intention. So this proposal, and I filed my first legislation in 1998 to repeal alternative minimum tax or minimum tax, it will save 28 million families from what we might call ugly minimum tax.
Well, I think at this point we'll take any savings for sure.
Exactly.
All right, let's talk about the debt ceiling. It looks like we really do need to figure out something by, is it February 15th or even early March at that point? This is the new deadline now that we're looking at. Is this something, again, that we're going to be raising once again?
The debt ceiling is being used as leverage. Now, let me point out something I think that's important as you raise a very good question. The debt ceiling, Laura, is not an argument about future spending. The debt ceiling is an argument about bills incurred. So when you get that, that we need to pay now, when you get that credit card statement and you look at what you've charged perhaps during the holidays, the idea is not to increase your spending, which will surely get you into trouble, but instead to pay the bills that have now been put in front of you.
Sure, not your credit limit.
Your credit limit. So my argument would be, if you want to think of a metaphor, The debt ceiling is not an argument about a new war. The debt ceiling is an argument about whether or not one voted for the war in Iraq, because the bill is due. All the money for Iraq was borrowed money. And it was done with these supplemental budgets in an effort to masquerade the size of the expenditure. So now the cumulative impact of these short-term fixes is in front of us. So when I hear this argument that our Republican friends are going to use the debt ceiling in an effort to leverage spending reductions, they contributed to the debt with votes that they cast on tax cuts and war.
Right.
So now the bill is due. It's as simple as that.
The bill is due. I think it certainly angers people, though. You know, I mean, how many times have we had this conversation about raising the debt ceiling in the last 5 years or so? You know, this is a conversation we've continued to hear, and I think it's probably frustrating for some that we have to keep raising it.
It's very frustrating, and it's frustrating to the extent that when you see the excitable use of language to make a point.
Sure.
The spin. This is about fiscal responsibility. That's all it is. That's the equation.
You have to pay your bills.
You have to pay your bills.
That's right. Congressman Richard Neal, we're going to continue this conversation with you after this, so stay with us. You're watching 22 News in Focus. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Right now we're talking to Congressman Richard Neal about the happenings in Washington and how they are affecting us here in Western Massachusetts. We just spoke about the fiscal cliff and the debt ceiling that looms right now. And, you know, I know a lot of people wonder what it's like in Washington when these are happening. I mean, we're logging onto our computers late at night and early in the morning to see if things happen. And sometimes we see at 2 a.m. a vote happened. You know, what are these negotiations like? You know, when you're talking to the lawmakers, I mean, the cameras are always on, but what is the feeling down there when this is happening?
Well, that's not where the negotiations take place.
Right, when the cameras are
on. The
on.
negotiations take place really in caucus settings. The leadership takes the pulse of the caucus to find out how far they can go. Recall, you reach a deal, but then you have to sell the deal.
Right.
So if you use surprise tactics to get people to the finish line, you might not sell the package. And that's what John Boehner learned with Plan B.
Plan B that didn't even go up for a vote.
That didn't even go up for a vote because he figured out in his caucus he couldn't pass it, so it would be embarrassing to take a defeat. But what typically happens, because we're not using the regular order would be committee hearings during the course of a year. But when you get to the end, and the precipice as I've described it, what you typically do is you will have party caucuses. The two parties caucus separately, obviously. Excuse me, and then you're brought up to speed on where the negotiations stand. You find out what's on the table, what has been settled, and then you try to use an extra sense to say, well, can I actually get this done? So, for example, as the vice president emerged from the negotiations to give us an update, I had a chance to question him in the caucus. And it's a respectful questioning, but as I said, I thought that part of it was very painful, but not to miss the point that I was very pleased with the abolition of the alternative minimum tax.
Sure.
I thought that, you know, as I've indicated, that for me that's been...
that's something you've been working on.
For almost a decade and a half.
Right.
So he would bring you up to date. So we discovered very quickly that Social Security was not on the table, that Medicare was not on the table, that chained CPI was not on the table, and that back to rates, that was on the table, raising rates. So we're headed back to the Clinton rates of 39.6 for people who make more than $450,000 a year as joint filers. And that's kind of the way it is. But I must tell you, in legislative life, frequently it is noted, everything's been said, but not everybody has said it.
Right.
So these caucus sessions go on for hours and hours. And the trick is to get in line fast to make your point.
Make your point, and hopefully it gets included, that's for sure. A couple other important pieces of legislation that the Sandy relief effort, the $60 billion package. Were you in support of that?
I was.
You were.
And I think that if I can describe it this way, Laura, this is the national principle at work. If there's an earthquake in California, we all come to the aid of California. If there are forest fires, as there were in Arizona, Alabama, and Missouri, or if there is a dreaded tornado here
in Western Mass,
we don't say, well, let's ascertain whether or not they deserve it. We say, let's factually determine how much they need. And that's what this is about. And I think for those poor families that have now been dislocated or back living in homes that are a mere shanty compared to what they once lived in, they're members of the American family. And this idea that you don't come to their aid is preposterous.
No, and those pictures are awful. Let me ask you, though, is it ever a consideration, you know, to somehow include asking someone to, I mean, what if some of these people are rebuilding right along the coastline that could be hit again? I mean, that's sometimes a target.
Well, that's a separate issue, and that's a reasonable discussion, and I think it's one that needs to be had.
Is it ever worth it to put our money into having them build in a safer place where it may, storms that may come around next season?
I don't think the federal government ought to underwrite the insurance to encourage people who have lost their homes because of erosion at the shore, that they ought to rebuild because the federal government is going to insure them.
Right.
I think those are precautions that you ought to be able to take without the omnipresence of the federal government.
Sure, absolutely. Moving along, legislation that you think we may see this year, of course, the Connecticut shooting didn't happen in Massachusetts, but it happened nearby, and it happened to the whole country. That's something that we all saw. Many people wondering if their kids are safe in schools. Do you think that gun control is something that's going to be discussed?
Consider the horror that one might feel as you've kissed that child goodbye for the last time, not knowing it. You know, we never know when we've had our last haircut. We never know when we've driven through an intersection that we had not anticipated. But in this instance here, the tragedy of Newtown gripped the nation. 2 years ago, it was Gabby Giffords, a colleague of mine. There have been these random shootings, a dozen during the last 2 years, that have made use of the semi-automatic. And nobody that I'm aware of, including myself, is arguing to take guns away from sportsmen or hunters. Those who have a legitimate purpose, but I think that we ought to be able to know who's purchasing the weaponry. We ought to have some idea of what their mental health status is. And I think, in addition, I don't know why you need an assault weapon as a hunter. And I would go so far as, years ago, I proposed and was able to secure funding for a metric or a palm print that would allow you only to fire that weapon if you owned it, which means you would have gone through a rigorous screening process. And that, I think, would go a long way toward protecting policemen and policewomen, that if somebody ripped the gun out of their holster, they couldn't fire the weapon unless the palm print matched up with the biometric.
Right.
And I'd like to see that sort of conversation take place again. So those are the kinds of things I think that we need to do. The problem with the argument over gun control in America has always been all or nothing.
Right.
And Vice President Biden is chairing this coalition, but the president's going to make it a priority. So I think this year that we ought to at least have the conversation as members of the American family.
It sounds to me like you would support a ban on assault rifles.
In 1994, I voted for a ban on assault weapons, and I thought that was a reasonable position.
Does that sound like something that's that could be realistic? Or?
Well, let's wait and see. And I think that the conversation needs to ensue.
At least get the wheels moving. And how about putting law enforcement in the different schools? I understand that that's a local budget thing, but what are your thoughts on having, you know, putting more law enforcement in schools, or, you know, even teachers with guns? What do you think about that?
I'm against that. As having been a teacher and still on the faculty at UMass, I think arming teachers is not a great idea. And at the same time, I think screening is important. Doors being locked is important. And I understand the argument that what this fellow did, you know, he was unimpeded for a long period of time as he shot his way through the doors and all, but not to miss the point that it was his mental health status, and you wonder why the guns were actually stored in a home with a child who was obviously hampered by the demons of mental illness. Right.
It is a double-pronged approach, it seems, that needs to be taken here to prevent this from happening. Congressman Neal, we are going to continue this conversation. Thank you so much, and stay with us. You're watching 22 News in Focus. You're watching 22 News in Focus. We're continuing our conversation now with Congressman Richard Neal about all that's happening in Washington and what's ahead for 2013. Just talking about some potential legislation and what your thoughts are on those big topics. What are some other things that you think that we'll be seeing this year? Obviously, the 91 viaduct here in Springfield is very important. Transportation in general, with the Union Station. Do you think that there will be some bigger projects ahead this year?
Well, we can look forward to, I think, work on improving track from New Haven to Hartford to Springfield on to Vermont. That's a big deal. Union Station's going to get done. I think you were just about being born when I was undertaking that project to get that done. And now we're going to have a first-class Union Station. It has an enormous emotional grip on people throughout the Pioneer Valley and western Massachusetts, largely because it was where men and women embarked for World War II and Korea and Vietnam. And it's where they return. So there's a huge emotional attachment to it. And it's going to be a first-class project. It's underway. And I think that in the hill towns, you're going to see extended broadband. That's going to be an important consideration. Still working on the last mile, as you know, but that's a very successful undertaking. And in Washington, we're going to continue, I think, to go back and forth on the budget deliberations. Clearly, the country needs a big transportation bill and also immigration reform. I think that those are all important considerations. But there's only so much oxygen in the room. So if the budget deliberations continue and you're doing these 2-month discussions and going again to the precipice, it doesn't allow you to get onto some of these other questions because you can only absorb so many challenges at once.
Right, and they're very important.
Very important.
Right, exactly. One thing also very important, affects everybody, is health care. There's always question as to whether, this Obamacare will be fully implemented. It came up for question when the Supreme Court took it on last summer. Do you think that this is something that will become another conversation? Of course, it's partially implemented right now, set to be fully implemented in 2014. Do you think that this is, we'll see changes? Or
you can see now that healthcare costs are stabilizing, and you can also see that the result of the last national election means that Barack Obama is going to be sitting in the White House for the next 4 years, and that means that the health care plan is going to be implemented. And I think that there are so many good things in that health care bill, and I think as people have had a chance to absorb them, to find out what's in, and to understand what ending pre-existing condition, more preventive services for women, not being able to exhaust or having a lifetime cap on benefits, and keeping your children on your health insurance until they're 26 years old. They've all been well met. And I think as we proceed to the coming year, the exchanges are falling into place, and the federal government is going to supplement those states who decide they don't want to do exchanges. So there will be a federal initiative, and I hope that many of the governors will continue to do what we've done here in Massachusetts, and that's to proceed with implementation of the law.
Some may argue that there are some taxes included in the health care law, and also some taxes that were included in the fiscal cliff negotiations as well to Medicare, Medicaid health care providers that may really make it difficult for some hospitals to hang on to some of its staff as well. Any concerns about some of these taxes that may be putting an extra burden on health care providers?
Well, it's not so much the taxes, I think, that the hospitals are concerned about. It's the proposed cuts. And recall that many of the cuts are going back into the system.
Okay.
So on one hand, you might be arguing, for example, that the hospital might be seeing a cut in their expenditure. And I've been a real champion of these hospitals in every capacity. But the argument might be that as you pull back on this Medicare proposal, recall they're also getting 30 million new customers who will be privately insured.
Sure, that's true.
So, I mean, that's the way you want to look at this in terms of its equation. Look, I've been at this for a long time with healthcare. And it's like squeezing toothpaste with a cap on. You're never really certain as to the outcome, but it's technology that drives the cost of healthcare. And that mom who shows up in the emergency room with a sick child, they don't want to hear about limits to health care. They want to know that that child is taken care of with the best available professional staff and technology. And I think that the health care plan was never an argument about decreasing the costs of health care.
Sure.
It was about stabilizing the cost. American businessmen and businesswomen, they could not continue to absorb 15 and 20% increases in their health care premiums.
Sure. Because
the employee was never going to get a pay raise if the employer was looking at these huge health care costs year after year going up. So I think that, look, there were a lot of legitimate arguments But I think now the decision has been made to go forward.
Sure. Access and, of course, affordability. Two very important things. And you think that this has at least targeted that. While the health care bill may not have been perfect, you think that it at least is what's in the best interest for the country?
The closest we've ever come in America to universal health care has been Medicare.
Okay.
65-year-olds. You join this great club. What we're saying here is that you use the private sector, because this was hardly a government takeover. This was instead using the pricing of the private sector to determine outcomes. And price would discipline cost. And I think that's the argument that we made. And I think that there's an opportunity here. As you can see, many of the big healthcare providers in the country, they're recalibrating. They're saying, well, geez, as long as there's universal coverage, everybody's in, then we're in. And you use them to discipline price.
All right, very good. What are your thoughts on what's ahead as far as Senator Kerry is concerned? Of course, switching gears here, Senator Kerry appointed Secretary of State. A good thing for Massachusetts?
Oh, it's a terrific thing. It's a terrific thing for his career. Whether you voted for him or you didn't vote for him. You know, we've had this great history in Massachusetts of people who have run for president. Think of it. Jack Kennedy, Paul Tsongas, Michael Dukakis, John Kerry, Ted Kennedy. Not the least of which the Adams family.
Yeah.
So we've had this steady number of people who have run for president. Yeah. And it means that we've had two senators, Kennedy and Kerry, who have been terrific performers. And my sense is that this is a great career capper for John Kerry. And I think that he's auditioned for it for a long period of time. He chaired the Foreign Relations Committee. And my sense is he will be easily confirmed. And then we'll be on to another election here.
That's right.
In Massachusetts, even though even reporters are fatigued by this election prospect.
It's amazing that we're going to have another election here. Are you feeling at all optimistic about the new Congress? You know, it's a new year. We like to feel like it's a fresh slate here, but you know, we have some new faces down there. Are you optimistic about what's ahead this year?
I think that there are a series of issues, and not the least of which is 24-hour news, where the smallest item is blown well beyond proportion. And what you might not touch in commercial television, the cable outlets touch.
Right.
And it is the application, again, of incendiary terminology and overblown rhetoric. And I think that that contributes, along with interest groups who have figured out just where to put the needle in. So it makes it harder to get things done. But we had, during the end of the Clinton years, an extraordinary period of economic growth. 22 million jobs and an unemployment rate of 3.8%. And that was done with a president of one party and a majority of another in the House and still a Democratic majority in the Senate. So in that sense, I'm optimistic. But I think that the system needs to take a breather in the sense, just step back and do a better job of controlling excitable language.
Yeah. Do you think that we're headed in the right direction?
I think that this last round of negotiations, it certainly made the tax code a good deal more progressive. I don't think anybody would dispute that. It's a lousy way to do legislation.
Oh, man.
A terrible way to do legislation. But do I think that the outcome was okay? Not great? Yeah, that's the way I would describe it. Okay.
Okay, very good. Congressman Richard Neal, thank you so much for coming, and we'll, of course, be watching you this year and all your votes.
Always nice to be with you, Laura.
Thank you so much. And we are going to talk about our jobs and our local economy after this, so stay with us. You're watching 22 News in Focus.